Hi guys, so today I'm working on the cover for that short graphic novel that I've been working on for a while. And it is not done yet, but I was ready to start working on the cover. And for this one, it actually ended up being a lot more complicated than I thought it would be when I first did the sketch. Because from the sketch, it's just a portrait and a fairly simple looking background. But once I got into it, I started adding a lot more layers and a lot of different lighting effects. So it ended up being a lot of things that layered on top of each other to end up getting the final look that I wanted. So if there's anything that you're interested about as far as what I'm actually doing at any part in this piece, definitely let me know, because I know there's way more than I could actually talk about, but I'll try to talk about the things that I did specifically in this piece to make it look this way, and some of the things that I did a little bit differently in this piece than what I usually do. So for the background, when I did this first sketch, what I really wanted was something that looked monumental and dramatic and huge, and then I wanted this small looking plane to be flying through the building. So I really wanted to emphasize how huge these buildings were and to give this really dramatic, looming, almost hopeless feel through the buildings. But the first go at sketching out these the buildings, really, it didn't really capture the look that I wanted. It wasn't very dramatic, actually, and I knew that I wanted a 3-point perspective, so that's where there's a vanishing point way up in the sky, so it's diminishing up into the sky and it looks really huge. But when I did the first one, I didn't really set it up very well, so some of the buildings were they looked like they were going off at a different vanishing point, which meant that it just kind of weakened the whole look of it and it looked a little bit off. So I went back in and I did a new sketch, so these buildings ended up looking a lot taller and a lot more cohesive, so it really had a lot more of a dramatic, solid look to it, which really helped the mood and the look and the atmosphere that I wanted for it. So the thing that I ended up thinking about the most in this piece, and a lot of my decisions ended up coming back to this one issue, was the values for this piece. So for the background, I knew that I wanted it to be very dark. It was going to be a night scene, there was going to be a lot of smoke and kind of the smog, and I wanted it to feel really claustrophobic and dark and a little bit hopeless. And I also needed to make sure that the figure, that he appeared like he was in the same environment and not that he was just like transposed on top of it. And that was something that I kind of had to work through, and I don't think I really fixed it till the very end. But I also, he needed to look like he was in the environment, but I also needed him to be able to stand out from the background so that you could see him clearly and he wasn't blending in with it and getting lost. And that's really where I had to kind of find ways to make it work, but also it was kind of like a compromise, I guess, where I had to think about, okay, how do I make him come forward but not forward enough that he doesn't belong in the environment anymore. So one of the things that I did was I made sure he had a very dramatic light source so that he had a really specific shadow. So he had a lot of his face in the shadow, and it was really pretty dark. And that helped him look a little bit more like he was part of this dark environment. And then I had a rim lighting coming from the side that had this huge shadow, and that way it brought forward some of the features and it lit up his face a little bit more, and I was able to put a little bit of glow in some of the darker areas of the shadows for him. And I think that that helped him to come forward a little bit more, and it looked like it was this glowing source inside of a dark environment. And I think that it was fairly successful, at least at the beginning, and I was able to fix it so that it became more successful towards. And while I was working on this, I actually started pulling away so that the background and the figure, that they didn't really mesh as well as they did at earlier stages of the painting. So at the beginning, their colors kind of were a little bit more harmonious, and some of his colors were a little bit reflected in the background, and some of the background colors were reflected in him. But as I started editing things, I put down a layer that changed some of the colors for the background, that made it a lot cooler and a lot more of an atmospheric look to it. But it actually made it so that he stood out a lot more, and he was a lot warmer, and he didn't really fit in with the environment anymore. And that was one of the critiques that I got that was really helpful, was that he was too warm and the background was really cool, and they just didn't look like they're in the same environment. So the way that I fixed that was I went back in with just a blue layer over just where he was. And I think I set it to hue. It was either hue or color, and that means that it'll affect the colors behind him. And I dropped the opacity of that layer down so that it just affected it just enough that it began to cool his colors down, and he looked like he fit in with the cooler background. So one of the things that I did a little bit differently in this piece, and once I did it, it seems really strange that I haven't been doing this all along, but I actually used several different layers that stacked up on each other to create the shadow layer that I wanted, or the depth that I wanted from the shadows. So usually I do it all on one layer, or I'll have the background layer and the figure layer for the shadows all on one. And this time I decided that I wanted to try to give a little bit more depth to it. So I had most of the shadow on one layer that I had set to multiply, and I think I had the opacity down to, it was somewhere between 40 and 50, and the color was a pretty saturated purple like usual, but I got the bulk of where I wanted the shadow to be. And then I created another layer with all the same settings, and I went back in and I just added a little bit more depth to some of the areas that needed a stronger, darker shadow to it. So around his eye that's already in shadow, I added a little bit more so it had a little bit more dimension. And I also did that in the hair where he needed just a little bit more darkness where the shadow was not quite dark enough for the depth of where his hair was. And I did a little bit more to his clothing so that it was a lot darker towards his body, and as it fanned out, it got a little bit lighter. And I think this is something that I'm actually pretty excited about figuring out a lot more, because I have been feeling like my shadow layers have been a little bit lacking. Like the values that I'm creating in my pieces are just not as complicated, or they just don't have as much depth as I could be creating. So I think this is a good technique for me to try out, especially since I feel really happy with the way that I've been doing the lighting effects, and this is kind of the same thought process just for shadows now. So it seems like I said, kind of strange that I haven't tried this more before, but it just kind of clicked and it made sense this time. So I think the lighting was really what made this piece for me, and that I could have so many different lighting sources, because then I could have a lot of fun with that and just put down different ways to emphasize the areas that I wanted. Like I could emphasize his features that were already in shadow, and I could help bring him forward. So it was a really useful tool in making this piece have a lot more life to it and to look really interesting, even though it was a fairly dark night scene. So it was really fun to play with and to make sure that it worked right, and to bring it to my advantage to use the lighting that way. I think that I actually ended up using like 3 to 5 layers for each light source. So there was one light source that was on the shadowed side of his face, and then I think another one on the other side of his face that was more of a cool blue color. And then there was lighting for the plane itself, and then I think there was also lighting on the little windows up the building. So there was a lot of different areas that I was playing with the lighting, and it was just, I really loved that. I think that's why I love this piece so much, was because there were so many areas that I could play with the lighting. And I think that I had most of the layer setting, or the layer mode, as overlay or linear light, and those worked really well for this piece. Oh, and I will say really quick, one thing that I like to do for glowing effects is to have a more hard-edged light source, or right where it's hitting it. So like where the green is on the edge of his face, I had a pretty tight brush, and I went in and I added the core of the light where it's hitting him. And then I created another layer on top, and I took a much softer, more textured brush, and I went over that area so it looked like it's hitting his face and then glowing. And that really makes things pop, and it makes it look like it's glowing. And that is pretty much it for this piece. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you can catch all my future art videos. And until then, I'll see you at my next one.